Welcome to segment 2 of lecture 5. We're still concerned with the system of transitivity. So we locate it within the experiential column at clause rank. And this is the home, this cell, experiential intersected with clause, is the home, as it were, is a starting point for the system of transitivity. And the system of transitivity includes a number of subsystems, 3, a system having to do with the circumstances that may augment the clause nucleus, a system of agency that has to concern with the nature of the participation in the process, and then process type that is concerned with the domains of experience in which processes unfold. So we'll continue with the system of process type. Now there are 3 major process types: material, clauses of doing and happening; mental, clauses of sensing; and relational, clauses of being and having. And in between, as it were, we have 3 minor types. In between material and relational, existential. They are, as it were, related to material clauses where some entity comes into existence, and because they're often existence, being in existence, they're related to relational, except the relational always involves 2 participants, existential typically 1. And between mental and relational you have verbal, as it were, making mental content external by saying it. And finally, between material and mental, behavioral. They include sensing as activity, but also physiological behavior, even closer to material. So just to recap, transitivity is the experiential system of the clause as a figure, a model of a quantum of change as a configuration of process, plus participants directly involved in it, and indirectly involved or attendant circumstances. The circumstances, as it were, augment the combination of process and participants. And it's the circumstances that typically have the highest likelihood of alternative being expressed in a clause of their own right, on their own right, as we saw last time. So the system of transitivity composes 3 components, as I mentioned briefly just a moment ago. The system of process type, so the sorting out of the goings-on or quanta of change into a small number of different domains of experience, each with its own model of the nature of the process and the nature and number of the participants involved. So they're the ones that I just named grammatically: material, mental, relational, and then existential, verbal, and behavioral, 6 altogether. And secondly, the system of agency, the modeling of the initiation of the process as being initiated involving 1 participant, we call this middle, or being initiated by an external cause. We call this not middle, no, Christian, we call this effective. So agency really has to do with the nature of the participation in the clause in terms of the possibility of an external cause. And finally, the system of circumstantiation, the augmentation, as I put it, of the configuration of process plus participant or participants involved in it by means of circumstances, augmenting the configuration by elaborating it, the circumstance of role, extending it, circumstance of accompaniment, or enhancing it circumstantially in some way. And the rest really place, time, different types of cause, different types of manner, and a few other types of augmentation by enhancement. So as I said before, here I will focus on the system of process type. But first, an example showing the domain of all 3 systemic components. So I want to give you a clause where you have all 3 systems involved: process type, agency, and circumstantiation. Now, In fact, in any clause, process type and agency will be involved, but a given clause may not be augmented circumstantially, so there may not be any circumstances. So here's the example. I've loved you 3 summers now, honey. I've loved you 3 summers now, honey. Textually, the theme is I. It's about me. And then the rest is the rime. Interpersonally, it's a proposition, and the proposition has as the modal responsible element I. So a case where the subject is the theme, since the clause is a declarative, unmarked theme. So I've loved you 3 summers now, honey, haven't I? No, you haven't. Have you? I suppose you have. And interpersonally, then you have the mood element, subject and finite. This is the one where the sequence of the subject and finite determines the mood type. And you also have something that falls outside mood and residue, evocative. And that could come at the beginning of the clause, or indeed somewhere in the middle of the clause. So, honey, I've loved you now. Honey, I've loved you 3 summers now. Or I have, honey, loved you 3 summers now. Or I have loved you, honey, 3 summers now. So honey, as evocative, is an interpersonal element that may be placed, as it were, prosodically throughout the clause. In any case, we're really not aiming for the interpersonal now, we're aiming for the experiential. So what's the experiential structure of the clause? Well, it's a clause having to do with process of consciousness, an emotive one, process of loving, of feelings, this kind of thing, right? So you have an emoter, or more generally a sensor, involved in the process of loving. So the process of have loved, so that's past time in present, as opposed to love, or loved, or will love, or had loved, and so on. And then one participant, the lover, I, we call this more generally the sensor, because processes of consciousness are processes of sensing. And then the phenomenon being sensed, you. So I've loved you. And that would be a perfectly possible clause of this mental emotive type. The process, have loved, 2 participants, sensor I, and phenomenon being sensed, you. But the clause is augmented by 2 circumstances. One indicating extension in time, so duration, 3 summers. How long? 3 summers. And one location in time. Time. When? Now. And if we add the sequence of clauses then, of classes, of groups and phrases, we have nominal group, subverbal group, nominal group, adverbial group, nominal group. And these then function experientially in the transitivity structure as nominal group sensor, verbal group process, nominal group phenomenon, nominal group duration, adverbial group time, and then outside the experiential structure of the clause, but within the interpersonal structure of the clause as a move, a nominal group serving as vocative. I've taken this example from Taylor Swift's song Lover. So here they have the clause nucleus of process plus participants directly involved in it. As I said, it's a mental clause. We can say that it's emotive as opposed to cognitive or perceptive or desiderative. And it's phenomenal. So the thing being sensed is a phenomenon rather than a metaphenomenon or a macrophenomenon. We can come back to those. In terms of agency, it's middle, ranged. So there is no representation of this as being caused by an external element. So I have loved, and then specification of the domain of love, the object of love, that's the arranged option, phenomenon. And so the systems of process type and agency determine the nature of the process and the nature and number of participants directly involved in the process. But then you also have the augmentation I mentioned, the circumstantiation. And this circumstantial augmentation has two circumstances, as we've seen, duration and time. And the system of circumstantiation determines the augmentation of the combination of process plus participant or participants by one or more attendant circumstances. So attendant or indirectly involved. So this is the example.
I've loved you 3 summers now.
That's it. Not the whole song, just the example. Thank you, Taylor Swift. So let us build this up systematically. So we're talking about the system of transitivity, the system for construing our experience of the flow event as a quantum of change, and specifically one of the 3 major systems, the system of process type. So the construal of experience into distinct domains of flux. If we say that the flow events, we interpret that as flux with different models of participation, the ones I mentioned. But let's build this up step by step. And I'll use some passages from Halliday and Matheson. So Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar, chapter 5. I start with pages 213-14. So we introduce the notion of process type as follows. What are the different types of process as construed by the transitivity system in the grammar? So the picture we derive from English is something like this. For other languages, see a chapter by me on general motifs across languages, generalizations when we look at descriptions of different languages. There is a basic difference that we become aware of at a very early age, 3 to 4 months, between inner and outer experience, between what we experience as going on out there in the world around us and what we experience as going on inside ourselves in the world of consciousness, including perception, emotion, and imagination. So this is a very fundamental distinction, and we can actually trace this back to long before young children start their path into the mother tongue spoken around them, even before they start on proto-language. The prototypical form of the outer experience is that of actions and events. Things happen, and people or other actors do things or make them happen. The inner experience is harder to sort out, but is partly a kind of replay of the outer, recording it, reacting to it, reflecting on it, and partly a separate awareness of our states of being. The grammar sets up a discontinuity between these two. It distinguishes rather clearly between outer experience, the process of the external world, and inner experience, the process of consciousness. The grammatical categories are those of material clauses and mental clauses, as illustrated by I'm having a shower, that's material, and I don't want a shower, mental. So if you go back to the circular representation of the process types that I introduced this section by, you'll find both material and mental represented there. Text examples of these and other process types are given in table 5.1, so you can access that if you'd like to. For instance, you produce so much money is a material clause, construing the outer experience of creation of a commodity. But I was fascinated by it is a mental one, construing the inner experience of an emotion, attraction, interest. Or to construct a contrastive pair, the machine is producing, sorting, destroying money is material, whereas people love, hate, want money is mental. Let's stop for a moment, stop the quoting from Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar, and contrast these two, material, mental, outer, inner experience. So let's explore this basic distinction for a moment. The distinction is strued by the grammar of transitivity between inner experiences, process of sensing, represented by mental clauses, and outer experience, process of doing and happening, represented by material clauses. Now, as an aside, incidentally, notice that the way I've written doing and happening, it's to suggest that it's really one concept. It's just that we haven't got a term, a verb that covers both doing and happening. Of course, they may be differentiated in the grammar, but overall, when we talk about the nature of the experience represented by material clauses, is that of doing and happening. So actions, events, activities, and so on. So our experience of doing and happenings, actions, activities, and events in the world around us, the outer experience, is construed by mental clauses. Now, interestingly, in comics, such experiences can be represented entirely by drawing within a panel. So using entirely the pictorial system in this multimodal way of telling stories. So possibly with sound effects added. So here's an example. Bang. So you can think about how would you verbalize this, and it's a useful exercise. You can look at an image, a drawing, a photograph, a painting, and you can ask, how would I verbalize it? How would I translate that into English or another language? So there is no language here. I mean, bang is just treated as a label on the sound effect. But there's no languaging going on. And the additional lines are clearly those representing doing and happening. So body swerving around, the movement of bullets, and so on. Now, what about the inner experience? Well, our experience of the sensing, perceiving, thinking, wanting, feeling in the world inside us, so our world of consciousness, our inner experience, is construed by mental clauses. So let's add them to the diagram. And I'll do this suggesting that inner experience by placing a circle within the circle. So the inner experience of sensing, perceiving, thinking, wanting, feeling. Now, precisely because these approaches of consciousness, they may be construed as having a content of consciousness. The ideas that we perceive, think, want, feel. So content of consciousness or idea clauses. And note how they are represented in comic strips. Again, I'm relying on Tintin, created by Hergé, to give us the illustration. So mental clauses construe the sensing or conscious processing of a conscious being, prototypically human, but not only human, and then project into existence the content of sensing, the idea created by the conscious processing. Here, in the panel in the comic strip, you can see there is a special convention for representing this. A partition within the panel, a partition that contains material that is not part of the outer experience being drawn, depicted in the panel. So, in comics, they are represented pictorially. Combination of sensor and process, sensing, and linguistically, the idea of the projected in a special partition in the panel, a thought cloud. So there is a very clear distinction in comics between the outer and the inner experience, between the experience that would be construed in the grammar of English by material clauses versus the experience, the inner experience, that would be construed by mental clauses, possibly accompanied by the ideas brought into existence, projected into existence by the process of sensing. Now let me pick up in quoting from Halliday and Matheson 2014. And that's to introduce the other process types. In addition to material and mental processes, the outer and inner aspects of our experience, a third component has to be supplied before this can become a coherent theory of experience. And note that is precisely what it is. It's a theory of experience, a theory or experience of goings on in the world. We learn to generalize, to relate one fragment of experience to another in some kind of taxonomic relationship. This is the same as that, this is a kind of the other. Here the grammar recognizes a third type, those of identifying and classifying. We call these relational process clauses, or relational clauses for short. For instance, every fourth African is a Nigerian is a classifying relational clause. The three major groups in the nation are the Yoruba in the southwest, the Igbo in the southeast, and the Hausa, finally, in the north, is an identifying one. So it takes some time to perhaps to get a sense of, to grasp, to get a feeling for the distinction between these two types, but it is in fact a very important distinction. So every fourth African is a Nigerian is, as it were, not not reversible. It just says every fourth African is a member of the set of Nigerians. But the second one sets up an identity between the three major groups in the nation, we're talking still about Nigeria, and then an exhaustive list, the set of these groups, the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Hausa. So let's now explore the third type, being and having, that are relational clauses in the model for construing experience in terms of classifying, set membership, and identifying equation. We can interpret first as a model for construing outer experience, complementing the material model. And what's the distinction here? Well, it has to do with the let's say the profile of the unfolding of the process in time. The material, doing and happening, and the relational are different here. So experience of the world model as doing and happening, unfolding in distinctive phases. That's the material model. We might call that dynamic. Contrast that with experience of the world outside modeled as being and having, unfolding as a uniform phase, no change from state to state. And we might call that static. That's the relational model. And you can see in drawings, in comic strips, they're actually fairly clearly differentiated. Here you have a drawing without language, with any partitions involving language, of something that would be construed in English as a material clause, and you can see the indications suggesting movement of the car. So there is one moving object in relation to the ground, and you could say it's approaching the mansion, right? It's reaching the mansion, it's driving towards the mansion. So we could say the car is driving towards Marlin's Pike Hall, Mourinzar, because we're still in the world of Tintin. Now try to imagine a static version of that, one where there is no indication pictorially of state change, just of being. Well, this is from the same story. As you can say, there is just this mansion, this hall, in existence, but we can report it as a relational clause. Marlin's Pike Hall is in the center of the estate, for example, or Marlin's Pike Hall is Captain Haddock's home. So there's a fairly clear distinction, both linguistically and pictorially, between our outer experience as doing and happening and our outer experience as being and having. Notice, importantly, the difference in tense, more specifically in present tense. In the material you have the car is driving towards Marlin's Pike Hall, not the car drives. So you have what is correctly characterized as a present in present, a tense combination that is being called, somewhat misleadingly, the present progressive or the present continuous. Whereas with the relational clauses representing the outside experience as static, you have the simple present. Marlinsbach Hall is in the center of the estate, not is being in the center. And Marlinsbach Hall is Captain Haddock's home, not is being Captain's Haddock home. Captain's Haddock home. If you said the car drives towards Marlinsbach Hall, that would suggest some kind of generalization. For example, every morning the car drives towards Marlinsbach Hall. Do you recognize that car? Yeah. Every morning it drives towards Marlinsbach Hall. So these are criteria for distinguishing material and relational clauses. And again, interestingly, the distinction is also reflected pictorially in the way that we draw these different kinds of experience of the outer world. Let me pick up again the quote from Hallett and Matheson, now moving to page 300. The three principal types of process in the English clause are material, mental, relational. They are the principal types in that they are the cornerstone of the grammar in its guise as a theory of experience. They present three distinct kinds of structural configuration, and they account for the majority of all clauses in a text. Material and relational seem to be roughly balanced in frequency over the language as a whole, followed by mental, although the pattern varies considerably among different registers, so different functional varieties, different text type, different genres. We can again go on to recognize three subsidiary process types located at each of the three boundaries. Behavioral at the boundary between material and mental, verbal at the boundary between mental and relational, and existential at the boundary between relational and material. And you can go back to the circular representation of the process types that I gave you before, but let me introduce another version of the circular representation. That's figure 5.3 in Haller's Introduction to Functional Grammar. Verbal. So as we suggested, verbal you find in between mental and relational. So I'll introduce verbal clauses here, leaving for later behavioral and existential ones. Verbal clauses construe the externalization of sensing and saying. They constitute part of the grammar's theory of moves in dialogic exchange. So you can say that they're part of the grammar's theory of speech events. So the grammar has evolved theories of different aspects of our experience, different aspects of our experience of flow events. And one domain that it sorts out is precisely the experience of languaging, as it were, of using language. So speech events, as I put it. To suggest that it's the externalization of mental, I've placed another circle here, but closer to material and also relational. Or maybe I should say closer to relational and also material. So mental, the world of inner experience; verbal, the way, in a sense, the world of inner experience being externalized. Now, to help ourselves remember this, we can think of this as a sort of, in terms of a schematic caricature of the head of a talking person and thinking person. So mental involves perception, visual and auditory, olfactory, various kinds of perception, and as we've seen, it also involves cognition and emotion and desire. Verbal, on the other hand, involves the externalization of anything that might be sensed. So here is a sort of mnemonic drawing to remember the distinction between mental and verbal. So verbal clauses can project clauses representing locutions, so what people say, speech, rather than ideas. And we have this, of course, reflected in traditional notions like direct, indirect speech. Here's an example again from Hergé. So Captain Haddock says to Tintin, "Rubbish. Dreams go by opposites, so they say. Don't think about it. Look, there's a letter from you from Hong Kong." Hong Kong? Have any of us written Tintin? No. So how is this represented in the panel in the comic strip? Well, you have a sayer, in this case, first Captain Haddock, and then you have a process of saying. And they are depicted just as we've come to expect. So participant and process are depicted, and they're depicted as in one representation of a participant that's also involved in the process, as we've seen already in segment 1. And then you have the content of saying. That cannot be depicted. So here the storyteller has to resort to language, and in this case he has created a partition, and within that partition you have the content of saying, the speech, the locutions. Now if you try to translate that into purely verbal form, you might simply say Captain Haddock said to Tintin. That's what is represented pictorially. And then what you have in the speech balloon, as we call them, rubbish. Dreams go by opposites, so they say. Don't think about it. Look, there's a letter from Hong Kong. For you from Hong Kong. So just to further illustrate, work this through illustrations, let me give you a couple of examples of the analogues in comics of construing quanta of change in the flow of events. So illustrating the way in which the pictorial and linguistic systems are deployed together to represent different domains of our experience of change as the narrative is developed, panel by panel. So here are two panels that illustrate what would be represented in English purely verbally as mental, verbal, and material. In the left panel, you have a representation of the experience that would be represented mentally and verbally. Interestingly, the sensor here is Milou, Snowy, and his ideas are projected by the process of sensing, represented in the thought cloud. Golly, what's the matter? He's tied up. And then there is also a verbal analog with Tintin as a sayer saying, "Go on, Snowy, go on." Again, the partition. But then in the panel next to the right, you have something that could be construed by material clause, just sound effects, but no thoughts, no ideas, no speech, no locutions. So it can be purely depicted. And here is a somewhat longer example of the same thing. A private jet landing on an island, a very short landing strip. And you can see very clearly whether it's purely doing and happening with differences in delicacy of focus, only language with sound effects, versus the ones that involve saying and also sensing. So we have verbal in this circular representation of process types. And the circular representation is designed to bring out the point, the fact that this is a continuous space with major regions distinct but shading into one another. So verbal depicted like this. So with the sayer and the process of saying drawn, but the content of saying the speech, the locutions represented within partitions, speech balloons. So that's verbal. And mental, processes of consciousness, sensing, again with the sensor and the process of saying, depicted, but the content of sensing, the ideas, the thoughts, represented linguistically within a special partition, a thought cloud. And then we had the example of material can rely purely on depiction with a sense of dynamicity, the change of the time, the implication of a vector of movement with change of the time, represented conventionally in the comic strip. And then finally contrasting with relational, static, no change over time. So whenever you sample the unfolding of the process of being, it'll be the same. The exception being process of becoming, but we'll come to them. So we have a major distinction between verbal and mental. These are clauses that can project the content of saying and the content of sensing. And they're separated from everything else in comic strips precisely because you have these partitions, speech balloons and thought clouds respectively. You have these positions allowing for the possibility to represent, in a sense, a higher order of experience, that which is projected into existence through language by saying or by sensing. And then you have two other process types representing, as it were, outer experience that cannot project. Static versus dynamic. So relational being and having, and material doing and happening. And the distinction between them is precisely the unfolding of the process over time. So within the material case and the analog, the pictorial analog, there is a sense in which one state is different from another, and in particular, the initial state is different from the unstate in the unfolding of the process over time. Whereas in the relational case, whenever you sample it, it's the same, it's uniform in the unfolding over time. So I've introduced systematically the system of process type, quoting from Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar to supplement what you have in Deploying Functional Grammar textbook, and taking illustrations from comic strips, again relying and heavily, in fact entirely, on Hergé's Tintin. So the next segment, 5.3, will be a continuation of the discussion of process types. Thank you.